There is a book that has been read by more human beings than any other object ever created. More than 5 billion copies printed, translated into over 3,000 languages. Read in mud huts in sub-Saharan Africa and glass towers in Manhattan. Whispered over the dying in hospital rooms and shouted from stadium pulpits in front of 100,000 people. It has started wars. It has ended them. It has freed slaves and been used to justify slavery. It has comforted the grieving and been used to terrorize children. It sits in the drawer of almost every hotel room on Earth, placed there by a quiet organization that has distributed more than 2 billion copies since 1908. Most people who own it have never read it all the way through. And almost no one has ever stopped to ask the question that changes everything once you ask it. Who wrote it? Not in the theological sense. Not God inspired it or holy men were moved by the Spirit. I mean the actual historical question, the archaeological question, the question a detective would ask standing over the evidence. Who were the human beings who held the pen? When did they live? What did they know? What were they trying to accomplish? And how much of what they wrote was memory, and how much was something else? Because here is the first fact. And it is not a conspiracy theory, it is not anti-religious, it is simply what the evidence shows when you look at it without flinching. The four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, were not written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. Not one of the four authors signed their work. The names printed at the top of each Gospel were added later, by other hands, in another century, for reasons that had nothing to do with the men who actually composed the text. This is not a fringe position. This is the mainstream consensus of New Testament scholarship, held by Christian scholars and non-Christian scholars alike, at Oxford, at Harvard, at the University of Chicago, at every serious research institution in the world that studies these documents. And it is only the beginning. Over the next hour, we are going to go further into the real history of the Bible than almost any video on this platform has gone before. We are going to talk about the 35 years of silence between the crucifixion and the first written gospel, and what happened to the story during those decades. We are going to talk about a man who never met Jesus and yet shaped Christianity more profoundly than anyone who did. We are going to talk about the Gospels that were buried in the desert, sealed in a clay jar, by a monk who refused to burn them, and what those Gospels say about who Jesus might actually have been. We are going to talk about a Roman emperor who convened the most important theological council in history, while still holding the title of chief priest of the pagan Roman gods. And we are going to sit with the question that 200 years of scholarship has been circling, carefully, rigorously, honestly. What did the man from Galilee actually say, in his own language, to his own people, before the translations, before the councils, before the politics? This is the complete investigation. Let's begin. Begin in Galilee, somewhere in the early decades of the first century of the Common Era, in a region of fishing villages and olive groves on the western shore of a freshwater lake the Romans called the Sea of Tiberias, a young Jewish man begins to preach. His name, in his own language, Aramaic, is Yeshua, a common name, the same name as the great Hebrew leader Joshua. We know him by the Greek translation of that name, Jesus. He is a craftsman's son, born, most likely not in Bethlehem, but in a small village called Nazareth, a settlement so insignificant it does not appear in any Roman administrative record, any Jewish historical text, or any document from the ancient world outside the New Testament itself. Nazareth was nobody's idea of a place where history begins. He speaks Aramaic, the everyday spoken language of working-class Jewish people in first-century Judea and Galilee. Not Hebrew. Hebrew by this period was primarily a language of scripture and liturgy, used in the temple and in religious study, not in the marketplace. Not Greek. Greek was the language of the educated, the urban, the Romanized elite. Aramaic was the mother tongue, the language of fishermen and farmers and carpenters, the language Jesus thought in, the language he prayed in, the language in which, if the Gospels are even broadly accurate, he delivered the Sermon on the Mount, told the parable of the prodigal son, and cried out from the cross. He gathers followers. He teaches of a coming kingdom. He heals. He argues with the religious authorities in Jerusalem. Memory passed from mouth to mouth, from Aramaic into Greek, from Jerusalem to Antioch, from Antioch to Corinth, from Corinth to Rome. Stories told by missionaries to converts who had never set foot in Galilee. Stories told in houses and marketplaces and the back rooms of synagogues. Stories polished by repetition, the way all oral traditions are polished. Smoothed and shaped and sometimes changed by every new voice that carried them forward. Think about what 35 years of oral tradition actually means. A child born the year Jesus was crucified would be middle-aged before the first gospel was written. An eyewitness who was 20 years old at the crucifixion would be in their mid-50s. The world they lived in had no recording devices, no printing press, no standardaus d'ortografia. No way to verify that the story being told in Rome in the year 65 was the same story told in Jerusalem in the year 35. Scholars who study oral tradition, the anthropologists and folklorists who have spent careers examining how stories travel through illiterate and semi-literate cultures, have documented something important. Oral traditions are not static. They are living things. They adapt. They absorb the concerns of the communities that carry them. They answer the questions that those communities are asking. They lose details that seem irrelevant and gain details that seem important. This does not mean they are worthless. Ancient oral traditions can preserve genuine historical memory with remarkable accuracy, particularly when they are short, rhythmic, and repeated in ritual contexts. The parables of Jesus, pithy, memorable, structurally tight, are exactly the kind of material that oral tradition preserves well. But 35 years is a long time, and the journey from Aramaic to Greek is not a small step. It is a translation, and translation, as anyone who has attempted it seriously knows, is not a mirror. It is an interpretation. 1,000 small choices, each one placing the translator's thumb gently, or not so gently, on the scale of meaning. When the writing finally begins, it begins in Greek, the Gospel of Mark. Scholarly consensus places it around the year 70 of the Common Era, the same year that Roman legions under the general Titus besieged and destroyed Jerusalem, burning the Second Temple to the ground, ending the sacrificial cult that had defined Jewish worship for centuries, and scattering the Jewish population across the empire. Mark was written in Greek, by someone who, the text itself suggests, was not a native Aramaic speaker, by someone who had not walked with Jesus. The name Mark was attached to this gospel in the 2nd century by Christian writers attempting to establish what scholars call apostolic pedigree, a chain of authority connecting the text back to an eyewitness. The tradition identified this Mark with a companion of the Apostle Peter, suggesting that the Gospel of Mark preserves Peter's memories. It is a plausible tradition, cannot be verified. What can be observed is this: the Gospel of Mark is raw, urgent, propulsive. It uses the word immediately in Greek euthes over 40 times. It reads like a man writing fast, like someone who thought time was short, like someone writing in the shadow of apocalypse, because in the year 70 apocalypse had arrived. Then come the others. Matthew, perhaps 10 to 15 years after Mark, around the year 80 to 85, written for a Jewish Christian community navigating the trauma of the temple's destruction and working out what it meant to follow a crucified Messiah in a world where the old center of Jewish religious life no longer existed. Luke, roughly the same period as Matthew, perhaps slightly later, written for a Gentile audience, more polished, more concerned with social justice, with the poor, with women, with outsiders. Luke alone tells the parable of the Good Samaritan. Luke alone gives us the full birth narrative with the manger and the shepherds and the angels. Luke is a storyteller of the first order, and John the last, the strangest, written not until the very end of the 1st century, possibly into the early 2nd. By the time John was composed, every person who had known Jesus in the flesh, every single one, was almost certainly dead. John is a different kind of document from the other three. The Jesus of John speaks in long, elaborate theological discourses, nothing like the pithy parables of Mark and Luke. The timeline of John's Gospel is different from the other three in ways that cannot be harmonized. The theological vocabulary of John, the logos, the light, the word that was in the beginning, draws on Greek philosophical traditions that the fishermen of Galilee would not have recognized. John is a theological meditation, poem, an argument. It is not pretending to be history in the way that Luke, who opens with an explicit claim to careful research, presents itself. These 4 documents, written across a span of perhaps 30 years, by authors we cannot name with certainty, in a language the man they describe never spoke, are the foundation on which 2 billion people today rest their understanding of who Jesus was. That is not a reason to dismiss them. It is a reason to read them carefully, to read them honestly, to ask what they can tell us, and to be precise about what they cannot. Here is something that most people who have read the Gospels their entire lives have never been told directly. Matthew and Luke copied from Mark. Not loosely, not thematically. They copied word for word. In multiple extended passages, the Greek of Matthew and the Greek of Luke is identical to the Greek of Mark. Same vocabulary, same sentence structure, same unusual phrasings that no two independent writers would spontaneously reproduce. Scholars call this the principle of Markan priority, and it has been the mainstream academic position for well over 100 years. It is not controversial in the scholarly world. It is simply what the textual evidence shows, which immediately raises a question that the Church has not always been eager to answer loudly. If Matthew was written by the Apostle Matthew, one of the 12 disciples, a man who walked with Jesus, who ate with him, who heard his teachings firsthand, why would he need to copy from Mark? Mark, remember, was not a disciple. Mark had no first-hand access to Jesus. If Matthew was an eyewitness and Mark was not, why is Mark the source and not the other way around? The answer most scholars have arrived at is uncomfortable but unavoidable. The Gospel of Matthew was not written by the Apostle Matthew. The name was attached later, as it was with all 4 Gospels, to provide authority for a text that circulated without one. But there is a second puzzle embedded in the relationship between the Gospels, and it is stranger than the first. Matthew and Luke share a large body of material that is not in Mark at all. Extended collections of sayings and teachings, the Beatitudes, the Lord's Prayer, the parable of the lost sheep, the sayings about worry and wealth, passages where the Greek of Matthew and the Greek of Luke are again, sometimes word for word, the same. Where did that come from? They did not copy it from each other. The evidence is clear on that. The material appears in different contexts, different orders, different framings in the 2 Gospels. They were working independently from a common source, a source that no longer exists. Scholars call it Q, from the German word Quelle, meaning simply source. It is a ghost document, a text that can be reconstructed, partially, tentatively, from the overlap between Matthew and Luke, but that has never been found. No manuscript, no fragment, no quotation in any other ancient text that identifies itself as coming from Q. If Q existed, and the scholarly consensus is that something very much like it did, it would be older than any gospel we possess, possibly composed in the decade immediately after the crucifixion, possibly containing sayings of Jesus in a form closer to the original Aramaic than anything in the canonical New Testament. It would be the oldest Christian document in the world, and it is gone, whether it burned in the fires of the Jewish war, whether it was deliberately suppressed by later authorities who preferred the narrative Gospels, whether it simply fell apart from use and was never recopied, we do not know. We have its shadow. We have the hole it left in the 2 texts that drew from it. We do not have the document itself. Now let us talk about the contradictions, because they are real, they are significant, and they deserve to be examined honestly rather than explained away. Consider the birth of Jesus. In Matthew, wise men, the text does not say how many follow a star from the east. They arrive in Jerusalem and ask King Herod where the new king of the Jews has been born. Herod, threatened, consults his advisors, learns the prophecy points to Bethlehem, and sends the wise men there. They find the child, note, in a house, not a stable, present their gifts, and are warned in a dream not to return to Herod. Joseph is then warned in a dream to flee. The family escapes to Egypt. Herod, enraged, orders the massacre of every male child under 2 years old in the region of Bethlehem. The family stays in Egypt until Herod dies, then returns, and settles in Nazareth to fulfill yet another prophecy. In Luke, there are no wise men. There is no star. There is no massacre. There is no flight to Egypt. Instead, there is a Roman census ordered by the Emperor Augustus, requiring everyone to return to their ancestral city. Joseph, being of the line of David, travels from Nazareth to Bethlehem with the pregnant Mary. There is no room at the inn. The child is born and laid in a manger. Angels appear to shepherds in nearby fields. The shepherds come and worship. After the birth, the family follows Jewish law, the circumcision on the 8th day, the purification offering at the temple in Jerusalem, and then returns home to Nazareth. There is no detour to Egypt. There is no massacre. There is no Herod story at all beyond a brief mention of the name. These are not two accounts of the same event with different emphases. These are two accounts of two different stories. They cannot both be literally, historically true, because they describe incompatible sequences of events. Scholars have different ways of accounting for this. Some argue that both accounts are theological constructions, narratives built backward from the conviction that Jesus was the Messiah, shaped to fulfill specific Old Testament prophecies, and not intended by their authors as precise historical records. Others argue that one account may preserve a genuine historical core, while the other is largely theological elaboration. The debate continues, but the incompatibility itself is not in dispute. Consider the resurrection. In Mark, the oldest gospel, the women come to the tomb. They find it empty. A young man in white tells them Jesus has risen and will meet the disciples in Galilee. And then, in what most scholars believe is the original ending of Mark, the women flee in terror and say nothing to anyone. That is where Mark ends. No resurrección epidensis. No ascensión. No Jesus walking through walls or eating fish with his disciples. Just an empty tomb, a message, and terrified women running away in silence. The longer ending of Mark, the familiar passage where Jesus appears to Mary Magdalene, then to the 11 disciples and gives the Great Commission, is almost universally recognized by scholars as a later addition. It does not appear in the oldest manuscripts. Its vocabulary and style are different from the rest of the Gospel. It was added, probably in the 2nd century, by a scribe who found the original ending too abrupt. Matthew ends differently. Luke ends differently. John ends most differently of all, with a long series of resurrection appearances, including the famous scene where Thomas puts his fingers in the wounds, and a final scene by the Sea of Galilee where Jesus reinstates Peter after his 3 denials. These endings are not in conflict about the resurrection itself. All 4 Gospels agree the tomb was empty, but they disagree about the appearances, the location, the sequence, and the significance in ways that are difficult to reconcile as a unified historical account. And then there is the death itself. In Mark, Matthew, and Luke, the Last Supper is a Passover meal. Jesus eats with his disciples on the night of Passover and is crucified the following day. In John, the chronology is different. Jesus is crucified on the day of preparation, the day before Passover begins. At the same hour, the Passover lambs are being slaughtered in the temple. The theological implication in John is unmistakable and clearly intentional. Jesus is the Passover lamb. He dies at the moment the sacrificial lambs die. It is a powerful image. It is also a different day from the one the other 3 Gospels describe. One of them has moved the clock. The question is which one and why. The most plausible scholarly answer is that John moved it. That the 4th Gospel reshaped the timeline for theological reasons, to make the typology explicit, to connect the death of Jesus symbolically to the sacrificial system of the temple at the exact moment that system was operating for the last time. If that is right, and it is the mainstream view, then the Gospel of John is doing something that challenges our instinctive assumptions about what the Gospels are. It is not primarily a record of what happened. It is primarily an argument about what it means. And that distinction between record and argument, between history and theology, is the key that unlocks everything that comes next. Picture a man on a road. The road runs north from Jerusalem toward the ancient city of Damascus, through a landscape of pale limestone hills, olive groves, and the occasional Roman milestone. The year is somewhere around 34 or 35 of the Common Era. Jesus has been dead for perhaps 2 years. The man on the road is not a follower of Jesus. He is, by his own later account, the opposite. He has spent the last year or 2 hunting down the followers of the crucified Galilean, dragging them from their homes, throwing them into prison, standing by approvingly at their executions. He is a Roman citizen, a privilege of enormous practical value in the 1st century. He was born in Tarsus, a sophisticated city in what is now southern Turkey. He is educated, trained in Jerusalem under one of the great Pharisaic teachers of the age, a rabbi named Gamaliel. He is ambitious. He is intellectually formidable. He is utterly convinced that the movement he is suppressing is a dangerous heresy that must be destroyed. His Hebrew name is Saul. His Roman name, the one history will remember, is Paul. And then something happens. Paul himself describes it in his letter to the Galatians, one of the 7 letters whose authenticity is accepted by virtually all scholars. He says he received his gospel not from any human source, not through any human intermediary, but through a direct revelation of Jesus Christ. A flash of light, a voice, a vision. He does not describe it in the physical detail that the book of Acts provides. The falling to the ground, the blinding, the 3 days without sight. Those details come from Luke, writing decades later, and appear in 3 slightly different versions across the book of Acts that cannot quite be harmonized. What Paul himself says is simpler and more austere. He saw the risen Christ, and that vision was sufficient. Whatever happened on that road, whether it was a psychological crisis, a genuine mystical experience, or something else entirely, Paul believed it completely. And out of that belief, he built a theology that would outlast empires. Paul's 7 authentic letters, 1 Thessalonians, Galatians, 1 and 2 Corinthians, Philippians, Philemon, and Romans, were written between approximately 50 and 57 of the Common Era. They are the oldest surviving Christian documents in existence. When Paul sat down to dictate his letter to the Romans, the Gospel of Mark had not yet been written. It would not be written for another decade or more. The theological foundation of Christianity was laid before the biographical foundation was even attempted. Read those letters carefully, and something remarkable emerges. In all 7 letters, across tens of thousands of words of dense, urgent, brilliant theological argument, Paul almost never quotes anything Jesus said during his earthly ministry. He does not retell the parables. He does not describe the miracles. He does not quote the Sermon on the Mount. He mentions the Last Supper in one passage of 1 Corinthians, one of the oldest pieces of tradition we possess about that event. He mentions the crucifixion, the burial, and the resurrection appearances in a passage of the same letter that scholars believe Paul himself received as tradition from the Jerusalem community within a few years of the crucifixion. But the teacher, the Galilean preacher walking the dusty roads between fishing villages telling stories about seeds and lamps and lost sheep, is almost entirely absent from Paul's letters. What Paul cares about is not the teacher. What Paul cares about is the event. The cosmic event of the death and resurrection of a divine figure called the Christ, and what that event means for the salvation of not just Israel, but the entire world. And here Paul's vision diverges, sharply, fundamentally, from the vision of the people who had actually known Jesus. Back in Jerusalem, the brother of Jesus, a man called James the Just, was leading the original community of followers. James was known for his piety, his strict observance of the Jewish law, his daily prayers in the temple. His community looked, from the outside, almost indistinguishable from any other devout Jewish sect of the period. They kept the Sabbath. They observed the dietary laws. They circumcised their sons. They believed Jesus was the Messiah, and they waited for his return. But they did not believe that following Jesus meant ceasing to be Jewish. Paul believed something entirely different. Paul believed that the message of Jesus was for everyone, Jew and Gentile alike. And crucially, he believed that Gentiles did not need to become Jews first. No circumcision required. No dietary laws. No Torah observance. What was required? Paul preached with the certainty of a man who had received his gospel by divine revelation, was faith. Faith alone. In the death and resurrection of the crucified Christ. The collision between these two visions, Paul's universal, law-free gospel of grace, and James's Jewish-centered, Torah-observant movement, is the great hidden fault line running through the earliest decades of Christianity. Around the year 49, the argument became so heated that a council was convened in Jerusalem. Paul and his companion Barnabas traveled from the mission field to face James, Peter, and John, the pillars of the Jerusalem church, and argue their case. We have 2 accounts of what happened. The book of Acts, written by an admirer of Paul, a generation after the events, presents a relatively peaceful resolution. Reasonable men reaching reasonable compromise. A letter dispatched to ease tensions. Brothers in agreement. Paul's own letter to the Galatians, written close to the event, still hot with the anger of it, tells a different story. In Galatians, Paul describes a bitter public confrontation, not just at the council but afterward in Antioch, where Paul stood up in front of the entire congregation and rebuked Peter to his face. Peter, the fisherman from Galilee, the man who had walked with Jesus for 3 years, who had heard every parable, witnessed every miracle, denied him at the rooster's crow. That Peter, being publicly corrected by a man who had never laid eyes on the living Christ. The conflict was never fully resolved. It was superseded by history. In the year 62, James the Just was executed, stoned on the orders of a Jewish high priest named Ananus during a temporary gap in Roman governance. The last direct family connection to Jesus was severed. 8 years later, in 70 CE, Roman legions destroyed Jerusalem. The temple burned. The Jewish Christian community, already weakened, already marginalized, was shattered. The version of the movement that James had led, the version that prayed in the temple and kept the law of Moses and waited for the Messiah's return, effectively ceased to exist. Paul's churches survived. Corinth, Ephesus, Philippi, Rome itself, Greek-speaking, Gentile, untethered from Jerusalem, spreading along Roman trade routes from city to city. Paul was probably dead by then, executed in Rome under Nero sometime in the mid-60s. But his letters survived. His theology survived. The Christianity the world inherited is not the Christianity of James the Just. It is the Christianity of Paul of Tarsus. These are not the same religion. They share a seed, the life and death of a Galilean preacher, but they grew into different trees. And the tree that survived is not the one that Jesus's own brother tended. On a December morning in 1945, in a stretch of desert in Upper Egypt near a limestone cliff called the Jabal el-Tarif, a young farmer named Muhammad Ali al-Salman swung his mattock into the dry earth looking for soft fertilizer soil. His mattock struck something hard. A clay yar, sealed, about 60 centimeters tall, buried at the base of the cliff. He hesitated. In the folk traditions of the region, sealed vessels buried in the desert were associated with spirits. But there was also the possibility of gold. And for a poor farmer with a family to feed, that possibility was enough. He broke the jar open. Inside were no coins, no treasure of any conventional kind. Only books, 13 of them, bound in leather, their pages made of papyrus, their ink faded but legible, their language a script he could not read. His mother, not knowing what the books were, is reported to have used some of the loose pages as kindling for the kitchen fire, feeding the flames with words that had been sealed in the earth for 1600 years. What Muhammad Ali had found was one of the most significant archaeological discoveries of the 20th century. 52 separate texts, a whole library of early Christian writings, sealed into the ground around the middle of the 4th century and forgotten by history. Written in Coptic, the late form of the Egyptian language, but translated, scholars quickly determined, from Greek originals composed in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. The Nag Hammadi library, as it came to be known, contained Gospels that no one in the modern world had read. Gospels that told of a Jesus no Sunday school child would recognize. The most famous is the Gospel of Thomas. Contains 114 sayings attributed to Jesus. And nothing else. No birth story. No miracles. No narrative of any kind. No crucifixion. No resurrection. Just sayings, enigmatic, aphoristic, sometimes luminous, sometimes baffling. The kingdom of the Father is spread out upon the earth, and people do not see it. Split a piece of wood, and I am there. Lift up the stone, and you will find me there. Whoever finds the meaning of these words will not taste death. Some of these sayings align closely with passages in the Gospels we know. Others seem to come from an entirely different spiritual universe. More mystical, more interior, less interested in the cross than in the awakening of a hidden knowledge within the listener. The scholarly debate about when Thomas was written has been fierce and unresolved for nearly 80 years. One camp places it firmly in the 2nd century, a later, more developed document drawing on and departing from the canonical Gospels. Another camp, including serious scholars at Harvard and the University of Toronto, argues that at least some of its sayings may be as old as anything in the New Testament. Possibly older. possibly preserving traditions of Jesus's teaching that circulated independently of the narrative Gospels and were never incorporated into the canonical text. If that second camp is right, even partially, then the Gospel of Thomas is a window into a Jesus that the canonical tradition did not preserve. But the Gospel of Thomas is only one text in a library of 52. The Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Truth, the Secret Book of John, the Apocalypse of Peter, text after text after text, all of them written by Christians, read by Christians, copied and preserved by Christians, presenting a vision of Jesus and salvation that the later Orthodox tradition would classify as heresy. These are the writings associated with what scholars call Gnosticism, an imprecise term covering many different groups with many different theologies, but united by a core intuition. The material world, in the Gnostic view, is not the creation of the highest, truest God. It is the creation of a lesser being, a craftsman god they called the Demiurge, who fashioned the universe out of ignorance or malice, trapping divine sparks inside human bodies. Salvation is not about forgiveness of sin. It is about knowledge, gnosis, the mystical awakening to the divine spark within, the recognition of one's true origin, the escape from the prison of flesh into the light of the true God. And then there is the Gospel of Judas, found separately in a different part of Egypt, restored beginning in 2001 by a team of international scholars, published in 2006. In the Gospel of Judas, the most reviled figure in the Christian story is quietly, completely rehabilitated. Judas Iscariot is not the betrayer. He is the only disciple who truly understands who Jesus is. He does not hand Jesus over to his enemies out of greed or demonic possession. He does it because Jesus asks him to. The betrayal is not a betrayal. It is the final act of a trusted friend, the act that frees Jesus from the prison of the body and allows the divine spark to return to the light. Whether you find this theology compelling or repellent is beside the historical point. What matters is that this text existed, that it was written by people who called themselves followers of Christ, that for centuries after the death of Jesus, there was no single, unified, settled Christianity. There were Christianities, plural, dozens of them, each with its own scriptures, its own rituals, its own community, its own interpretation of who the Galilean had been and what his death had meant. All of them calling themselves followers of Christ. And then something happened to all of them. In the spring of 367 CE, the Bishop of Alexandria, Athanasius, wrote his annual Easter letter to the churches under his care. And in that letter, he listed by name the 27 books that should be considered the authentic scriptures of the church. The 4 Gospels we know, the letters of Paul, Acts, Revelation, 27 books, no more, no less. The same 27 books that sit in every Bible on every hotel nightstand in the world today. Everything else was to be rejected, burned. Near the cliff where Muhammad Ali found that clay jar in 1945, there had once stood a Pachomian monastery, a community of Egyptian monks who copied and preserved Christian writings. When Athanasius's letter arrived, those monks were ordered to destroy every text not on the approved list. And someone in that monastery made a different choice. Someone we do not know who, we will never know who, took the forbidden books, sealed them inside a clay jar, carried that jar out into the desert, and buried it at the base of a cliff. 16 centuries later, a farmer looking for fertilizer found them. The books they tried to burn survived because one nameless person refused. In the early summer of 325 CE, in a lakeside town in what is now northwestern Turkey, more than 250 bishops gathered in a hall belonging to an emperor. They had traveled from every corner of the Roman world, from Gaul, from North Africa, from Persia, from Syria, from the mountains of Armenia and the great cities of Italy. Some of them still bore the marks of recent persecution. Missing fingers, scarred skin, bodies broken by torture under the previous regime. They had survived lions and fire and the systematic cruelty of a state that had, within living memory, been trying to exterminate them. They had come because a man with the power to kill them had summoned them. And the man who had summoned them was not a Christian. The Emperor Constantine. He had not been baptized. He would not be baptized until he lay on his deathbed, 12 years after this council. he still held the ancient Roman title of Pontifex Maximus, chief priest of the Roman state religion. The Great Arch of Constantine in Rome, built just 10 years before this council, bore no Christian symbols. It depicted sacrifices to Apollo, Diana, and Hercules. This was the man who called the Council of Nicaea. This was the man who paid for the bishops' travel, fed them at imperial expense, presided over their debates, and, when the council was finished, used imperial power to enforce its conclusions. The question before the council sounds, at first, like a matter of abstruse theological grammar. But it was tearing the Eastern Roman Empire apart. Congregations dividing, bishops writing furious letters against other bishops, mobs gathering in the streets of Alexandria chanting theological slogans most of them could not spell. The question was this: was Jesus Christ the same kind of being as God the Father? Or was he a different, lesser kind of being, supremely exalted above all other creatures, the instrument through which the universe was made, but ultimately created rather than co-eternal? The man arguing the second position was a presbyter from Alexandria named Arius, educated, ascetic, a brilliant preacher with a genius for putting theology into memorable verse. Arius taught, and thousands across the Eastern Empire agreed with him, that the Son of God had a beginning, that there was a moment before time beyond imagining, when the Son did not yet exist. God the Father alone was truly eternal. The Son was the first and greatest of all created things, but he was created. Against Arius stood his bishop Alexander, and a young deacon of extraordinary intellectual ferocity named Athanasius, the same Athanasius who would, 40 years later, write the letter that fixed the biblical canon. In 325, Athanasius was perhaps 29 years old. He was the most dangerous mind in the room. The council debated for weeks. Arius and his supporters argued their position. Athanasius and his party argued theirs. Constantine, who had initially hoped the whole dispute was a trivial misunderstanding that sensible men could resolve with a letter, realized as the weeks wore on that no easy resolution was coming. He needed a decision. He needed unity. He needed one Christianity, not 40. The council produced the Nicene Creed. It declared that Jesus Christ was, in the Greek, homoousios with the Father, of the same substance, not similar substance, not comparable substance, the same substance. That one word, homoousios, was inserted deliberately because it was the one word Arius and his followers could not accept. It was a theological line drawn in ink and backed by imperial power. Fewer than a dozen bishops refused to sign. Arius himself and two of his most committed supporters were excommunicated and sent into exile. Constantine ordered Arius's writings burned. Anyone found possessing them would be executed. The matter was settled. Except it was not. Within 2 years, Constantine changed his mind. He recalled Arius from exile. He began receiving Arian bishops at court. He turned against Athanasius, the hero of Nicaea, and exiled him, the first of 5 separate exiles that Athanasius would endure over his long career, each one for defending the very doctrine the council had supposedly settled. The emperor who baptized Constantine on his deathbed in 337 was a bishop named Eusebius of Nicaea, a close ally and supporter of Arius. Constantine died in the arms of an Arian. His son and successor, Constantius II, was openly, aggressively Arian. He used imperial power to force Nicene bishops out of their positions and replace them with Arian sympathizers. For most of the 4th century, the decades immediately following the Great Anti-Arian Council, Arianism was the dominant Christianity of the Roman Empire. The Germanic peoples who would eventually overrun the Western Empire, the Goths, the Vandals, the Lombards, were converted to Christianity during this period. They were converted to Arian Christianity by a missionary named Ulfilas who translated the Bible into Gothic. When these peoples took over the old Roman provinces of the West, they brought their Arian Christianity with them. It was not until the year 381, 56 years after Nicaea, that a second council at Constantinople definitively reaffirmed the Nicene position and made it the non-negotiable doctrine of the empire. And it was not until the Edict of Thessalonica, issued by the Emperor Theodosius in 380 CE, that Christianity, specifically Nicene Christianity, became the official state religion of Rome. Before that edict, Christianity had merely been tolerated. After it, all other forms of religious practice were declared illegal. Think about what that sequence of events means. The doctrine that most Christians today assume has existed since the beginning, the co-equal, co-eternal divinity of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, the rejection of any suggestion that the Son was created or lesser, was not settled for nearly 400 years after the crucifixion. It was settled not by consensus but by imperial decree. Not by unanimous theological agreement but by the political dominance of one faction over another at a particular historical moment. The bishops who signed the Nicene Creed in 325 did so under the watchful eye of an emperor who had the power to exile them if they refused, and who did, in fact, exile those who refused. This is not a reason to say the doctrine is wrong. It is a reason to understand what kind of thing it is, how it came to exist, what forces shaped it, what alternatives were defeated in its making. The most intimate theological questions human beings have ever asked, questions about the nature of God, the nature of Jesus, the nature of salvation, were answered for the majority of Western civilization in a hall full of arguing men under the supervision of a Roman emperor who was not yet a Christian, whose primary concern was not theology but unity, and who changed his mind about the conclusions of his own council before his own death. That does not make the answers wrong. It simply makes them human. Imagine the man from Nazareth walking through the doors of a modern church. Any church. A great cathedral in Rome with its marble saints and golden altars. A white clapboard chapel in rural Tennessee. A megachurch in Seoul with 10,000 worshippers and concert hall lighting. Imagine the historical Jesus, the one who actually lived, who walked the roads of Galilee, who spoke Aramaic, who ate with fishermen and tax collectors, who was arrested by Roman soldiers and died on a Roman cross outside Jerusalem somewhere around the year 30. Stepping through those doors, what would he recognize? Historians who have spent their careers studying this question give an answer that is quietly unsettling. Almost nothing. He would not recognize the building. He worshipped in synagogues and in the open air. He taught on hillsides and in fishing boats. He would not recognize the cross as a symbol of worship. In his lifetime, the cross was a Roman instrument of torture and execution, among the most degrading deaths the empire had devised, reserved for slaves and insurrectionists. No Jew of his era would have imagined venerating one. He would not recognize the name used for him. Jesus is a Greek rendering of the Hebrew Yeshua, filtered through centuries of translation. No one in his village in Galilee ever called him Jesus. He would not recognize the theology. Because the theology, the Trinity, the pre-existent divine logos, the satisfaction of divine justice through sacrificial death, was built century by people who had never met him, working in languages he never spoke, answering questions he never asked, in a cultural context he would not have recognized. The project of trying to recover the historical Jesus, to separate what the man actually said and did from what later tradition said about him, is one of the oldest sustained intellectual efforts in Western scholarship. It begins formally in the late 18th century with German scholars who started reading the Gospels not as inspired scripture but as ancient documents to be analyzed with the same critical tools applied to Homer or Thucydides. It reached a pivotal moment in 1906 with Albert Schweitzer, the theologian and physician who would later win the Nobel Peace Prize, and his landmark book The Quest of the Historical Jesus, which surveyed and largely demolished the previous century of scholarship and proposed a radically different Jesus than any of his predecessors had found. Scholars speak of three quests for the historical Jesus. Each has added something essential to the picture. The third quest, beginning in the 1980s and continuing today, has produced the most rigorous, evidence-based portrait yet. What does the historical evidence tell us? First, Jesus almost certainly existed. This sounds obvious, but it bears stating. The fringe theory that Jesus was a pure myth, invented wholesale out of nothing, has no support among serious historians. Not among Christian historians. Not among secular historians. Not among Jewish historians. Jesus was a real historical person. He had a mother. He had brothers. He was baptized. He taught. He was executed by Pontius Pilate. These facts are as well established as almost anything we know about the ancient world. Second, Jesus was, in the judgment of most contemporary historians, what scholars call an apocalyptic prophet. He believed and taught his followers that the kingdom of God was coming soon. Not as a metaphor. Not in some distant eschatological future. Soon. Within a generation. within the lifetime of people standing in front of him. The Gospel of Mark, in what most scholars consider its earliest and most reliable layer, records Jesus saying explicitly that some of those listening to him would not die before they saw the kingdom of God come in power. He sent his disciples out with the urgent instructions of men who had weeks, not years, to complete their mission. He warned of a coming judgment that was imminent. This is the thesis most forcefully associated with the scholar E.P. Sanders, who taught at Duke University, and with Bart Ehrman, now at the University of North Carolina and one of the most widely read popular scholars in this field. Both argue, from the earliest layers of the gospel tradition, that Jesus' central message was about an imminent cosmic transformation, and that this is what most distinguished him from a moral teacher or a social reformer. And the kingdom did not come, not in the form Jesus described, not within the generation he indicated, not at all by any conventional historical measure. This is the quiet embarrassment at the heart of 2 centuries of historical Jesus scholarship. The movement that became Christianity was founded in part on a prediction that failed. His followers faced this problem, the problem of the delayed kingdom, and did what religious communities faced with cognitive dissonance almost always do. They reinterpreted. They said the kingdom had come in a different and more spiritual sense in the resurrection. They said the second coming was delayed but certain. They said Jesus had meant something different from what he appeared to mean. The religion survived by transforming the original message. This is not a cynical observation. It is what human beings do with powerful ideas that outlast their original context. Third, and perhaps the most theologically significant finding of historical Jesus scholarship, the evidence suggests that Jesus did not claim to be God in the sense that later Christian theology would claim it for him. In the earliest gospel, Mark, Jesus never says plainly, "I am God." He speaks of himself primarily as the Son of Man, a phrase drawn from Jewish apocalyptic tradition, particularly from the book of Daniel, that referred to a coming divine agent but was not synonymous with God. He prays to God as a distinct person, with a desperation in the Garden of Gethsemane that would be difficult to explain if he believed himself to be God. He asks why God has forsaken him from the cross. The explicit claims of divinity, before Abraham was, "I am. I and the Father are one. Whoever has seen me has seen the Father," appear only in the Gospel of John, the last Gospel, the one written furthest from the events it describes. The scholar Bart Ehrman coined the term Christological escalation for the pattern this reveals. In Mark, Jesus becomes the Son of God at his baptism. In Matthew and Luke, he is the Son of God from his conception. In John, he is the divine Logos coexistent with God before the creation of the universe. Each generation of writers elevated the figure higher. Each pushed the moment of divinity further back in time, until by the end of the 1st century, the Galilean preacher who told stories about seeds and sheep had become the eternal Word through whom all things were made. Whether that escalation represents an accurate understanding of who Jesus was, a truth being gradually uncovered or a gradual construction, a theological portrait becoming ever more elaborate with each new generation of artists, is the question that divides believers and historians, and that cannot be settled by historical methods alone. What the historical methods can say is this: the picture was not always as it appears today. It developed, changed. It was shaped by communities and councils and controversies and the passage of time. The Christ of the creeds and the carpenter of Galilee are not simply the same person viewed from different angles. They are, in important respects, different portraits painted in different centuries by people with different agendas, different questions, and different tools. In 1947, a Bedouin shepherd boy named Mohammed Evdib was searching for a lost goat among the limestone cliffs above the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea. He threw a stone into a cave to startle any animal that might be hiding there. Instead of the sound of a goat, he heard something unexpected: the sound of breaking pottery. Inside the cave were clay jars, and inside the jars were scrolls, leather scrolls wrapped in linen, preserved by the extraordinary dryness of the desert air, hidden in the darkness of the cave for nearly 2,000 years. Over the following decade, archaeologists and Bedouin searchers found 11 caves in the same area containing nearly 1,000 manuscripts, the largest cache of ancient Jewish texts ever discovered. They are called the Dead Sea Scrolls. The scrolls were produced and collected by a Jewish sect, almost certainly the Essenes, who lived in a community at a place called Qumran on the edge of the desert. They were hidden in the caves around the year 68 CE, as a Roman legion approached to destroy the settlement during the Jewish War. The monks, if that is what they were, hid their library and then vanished from history. The scrolls do not mention Jesus. They predate most of his ministry, or are contemporary with it at most. They do not confirm or deny the gospel accounts of his life. But they do something equally important. They show us the world he lived in, the religious atmosphere he breathed, the ideas that were in the air in first-century Jewish Palestine. What the Dead Sea Scrolls reveal is a Jewish world crackling with apocalyptic expectation. The Qumran community believed they were living in the last days. They expected two messiahs, one priestly, one royal. They practiced ritual immersion, baptism, as a form of purification. They shared communal meals with eschatological significance. They organized themselves as a community set apart from a corrupt world, waiting for the final cosmic battle between the sons of light and the sons of darkness. Every one of these themes appears in the New Testament. The baptism that John the Baptist practiced, the communal meals that Jesus shared with his disciples, the expectation of an imminent kingdom, the apocalyptic imagery of judgment and renewal, the sense of a community set apart, living in the last hours of the age. Jesus did not copy the Essenes. He was not a member of the Qumran community, but he was a child of the same world, the same first-century Jewish world saturated with the conviction that something was about to happen, something final, something cosmic, something that would end the current age and begin a new one. The Dead Sea Scrolls also contain the oldest surviving manuscripts of the Hebrew Bible, 1,000 years older than the texts that had previously been available to scholars. They allow us to check the transmission of the Old Testament across a millennium of copying. What they show, overwhelmingly, is remarkable accuracy. The scribes who copied the scriptures took their work with extraordinary seriousness. The Great Isaiah Scroll, a complete copy of the book of Isaiah dating to approximately 125 BCE, agrees with the later medieval manuscripts in the vast majority of its text. The differences that exist are generally minor. This matters for the question of the Bible's transmission, and it complicates the simple narrative of a text hopelessly corrupted by copying errors. The Hebrew scriptures, at least, were copied with care. The question of whether they were composed with historical accuracy is a different question, one the scrolls do not resolve. What the scrolls do, above all, is make the first century vivid. They make it specific. They place Jesus not in a vacuum, not in a theological abstraction, not on a stained glass window, but in a real, specific, historically recoverable world. A world of competing messianic expectations, ritual purity debates, apocalyptic urgency, Roman occupation, and the acute sense that the old order was ending. A world in which the questions Jesus asked were questions everyone was asking, and in which his answers were one voice among many, distinguished not by their uniqueness but by what became of them. We have covered a lot of ground. We have followed the story of the Gospels from the 35 years of silence after the crucifixion to the moment the first sentence of the first Gospel was written in Greek in the shadow of burning Jerusalem. We have sat with the contradictions in the text, the different birth stories, the different death scenes, the different Jesuses of Mark and John. We have traced the career of Paul of Tarsus, the man who never met Jesus and yet, more than any other single human being, determined what Christianity would become. We have opened the clay jar Muhammad Ali found in the Egyptian desert and read the Gospels that were buried there, the Gospels they tried to burn, the Gospels the nameless monk chose to save. We have sat in the hall at Nicaea and watched 250 bishops argue about a single Greek letter under the eyes of an unbaptized emperor, and watched the settlement they reached unravel within 2 years and take another half-century to stabilize. And we have tried, as honestly as we can, to see the man from Galilee, not through the lens of 19 centuries of theology and art and politics, but as the historical evidence describes him. A first-century Jewish apocalyptic preacher. A man who believed the kingdom was coming soon. A man who may not have claimed the divine status later tradition assigned to him. A man whose words passed through 35 years of spoken memory and the translation gap between Aramaic and Greek before anyone wrote them down. Now, what do we do with all of this? I want to be direct about where I stand. I think the honest engagement with this history, the real history, not the sanitized version, does not destroy the Bible. It makes it more remarkable. Because think about what it means that this story survived at all. Think about the chain of human decisions, human commitments, human courage, and human stubbornness that had to hold across 20 centuries for these words to reach you. The missionaries who carried the story on foot across the Roman Empire. The monks who copied manuscripts by candlelight in freezing scriptoria. The nameless person who buried the forbidden Gospels in the desert instead of burning them. The scholars who dedicated their lives to understanding documents most of the world could not read. The Bible is not a book that fell from heaven preassembled and error-free. It is something stranger and in some ways more extraordinary than that. It is the record of human beings wrestling with the biggest questions that exist. Who are we? Why does it hurt? What do we owe each other? Is there anything beyond the darkness? And refusing to stop wrestling. Passing the wrestling match from generation to generation. Revising, arguing, preserving, losing, finding again. The man from Galilee, whoever he was, whatever he believed, however much of what we know about him is accurate, provoked a question in the people who encountered him that has not been settled in 2,000 years. What is the nature of the good? And what does it cost to live by it? That question is not smaller for being asked honestly. If anything, it is larger. This channel exists to ask that question without flinching, to follow the evidence where it leads, to take the history seriously, all of it, the councils and the contradictions and the buried jars and the 35 years of silence. If that is the kind of investigation you want to be part of, subscribe. Turn on notifications, because the next chapter of this story goes even deeper. The search continues.